One of the most interesting residents of West Newbury for me is Ben Poore. Ben Poore is some distant cousin of mine I'm here at the Poore house on the Poore farm. But his family was a branch that lived on Indian Hill. And in fact, his mother was from Georgetown near Washington, well, in what is now Washington, D.C. But his father was a descendant of the Poores that had lived at Indian Hill forever. So the Indian Hill farm had been part of the family for a long time. Ben Poore was born in 1820 at Indian Hill, right down the road in West Newbury. And his father, when he was very young, took him to Washington, D.C. His father also owned a newspaper in Georgia. So he had this very interesting West Newbury life that also was quite cosmopolitan. He spent a lot of time in Georgia. He was left behind for a while his parents were in D.C. at what was then Governor Dummer Academy, where he was kicked out for unruly behavior. So he was not a successful student, but he really made a name for himself. He traveled extensively in Europe. He made a name for himself as a newspaper man. He was a newspaper correspondent and a frequent letter writer to newspapers that he did not work for, and he was really a larger-than-life figure. He was a supporter of the Republican and Whig Party, and he was probably best known in 1856. He lost a bet. He had a bet that the presidential candidate in 1856 would receive more votes in Massachusetts than the opposition. He lost that bet. And the bet that he had made is that he would wheel a wheelbarrow full of apples from West Newbury to Boston, which he did. And even though he was told that he could get out of that bet, he did that. And cheering crowds lined the road. People rode on horseback alongside him. He really became a sort of a folk celebrity at that point. He also, during the Civil War, established a rifle company. He was made a major in that company, so to the end of his life he was known as Major Ben Poore. With the unique title, he would put a colon after Ben, so it would say Ben, Poore. He was a very interesting guy. Washington, D.C. was a much smaller place back then, and the fact that he worked for a while as an attaché in government. He was very friendly with Abraham Lincoln. He was certainly an ardent abolitionist. You know, he was a man that almost anyone in D.C. would have known, and certainly he had a lot of popular cachet as well, because he was, you know, he was not only his writing appeared in newspapers, he was a political figure as well. He ran for a Senate seat in Massachusetts, so everyone would have known who he was. Several images of his house and images of him pushing the wheelbarrow to Boston appeared in national, very, very widely read magazines like Harper's and Godey's Lady's Book. So he would have been what we would call today a household name. People all over knew who he was. He had a reputation as being a sort of a larger-than-life, somewhat eccentric character, which it seems that he certainly was. I have a particular attachment to him, in part because of the house he built on the Indian Hill farm that had been in his family for many generations. He built a wonderful sort of antiquarian's house in 1880 called Indian Hill. The majority of it burned in the middle of the 20th century, but the house that he built was remarkable for a variety of reasons. It was sort of a collector's and decorator's house. It was built to look like a castle, sort of a castle gatehouse, and it housed an incredible collection of books and antiquarian objects, you know, George Washington's cane, various pieces of furniture, dishes, books. He had love letters from Napoleon. He had all sorts of interesting objects. He was a collector at a time when collecting antiques or old items really wasn't common the way it is today. He was really at the forefront of interior design, of the antiquarian movement. He was a preservationist to the extent that at least in objects, maybe not in buildings, but in objects for sure. And he just had he was such an interesting character. His work influenced, he had an octagon room in his house that was a library. It was his library. There's an octagon room at the home of Henry David Sleeper in Gloucester at his home Beauport, which was internationally famous, and then also influenced Winterthur. DuPont was influenced by Sleeper. So he really was at the forefront of this design world, and was very, very early on. He was collecting things in the 1850s when, long before it was really a common thing to do that. He was one of the first people who looked at objects that had belonged to ordinary people but were old and saw them as beautiful and worth saving. And of course, again, if you look at that, how early he's doing this in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. And major preservation organizations didn't really kick up steam until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. The oldest regional preservation organization in the country is Historic New England, which was then SPNEA. It was established in 1910. Historic New England has a direct tie to Ben Perley Poore. In fact, they owned Indian Hill for a while before turning it back over to his family. He really was, in a lot of ways, one of the founders of the modern antiquarian preservation movement. Again, he really saw the value in preserving ordinary objects from the past, as well as objects that belonged to important people and objects from his own family's history. I think anyone that lives in what is called a colonial house, which is probably, 70% of us in New England, owes the idea of colonial as a design concept to Ben Perley Poore. His influence cannot be underestimated, although most of us have never heard of him today. He was really one of the very first people who said objects and items from colonial New England and designing your living space to mimic colonial New England architecture and design is cool. Even though he didn't live in what we would identify as a colonial house, he really developed the idea of collecting and designing rooms around certain themes. And one of the themes that he loved the most, of course, was the colonial period. So I see he was very early on in the process. This is back when people were still living in colonial houses because that was the house they inherited, actual colonial houses from before the Revolution. It wasn't a style, it was just a fact. And he was the first one that really took the aesthetic. And again, some of it was totally made up. It really was not the way colonial houses were used or were looked, but it was his idea of it. And so now, here we are. If you live in a development with a colonial style house, you owe some of the way that your house is put together and the concept of colonial as a decorative, desirable decorative element, you really owe in part to Ben Perley Poore. He also had a pine kitchen. He was one of the first people to intentionally recreate his version of a colonial kitchen in his house. People in the 1870s and 80s really wanted to live with modern things, or what they considered modern things. And the fact that he was so backward looking and also a celebrity and had the money and the name to be a successful collector just made him so interesting. So he has an international legacy. He really changed our world and changed the way that we think about collecting, the way that we think about antiques and antiquarian objects. And he unfortunately did not live to enjoy Indian Hill for very long. He died in 1887 at a relatively young age. Well, it was not young for those times, but it would be young for today. But he really had a very long-lasting impact that can be seen today, probably best seen at Beauport, which is the home of Henry Davis Sleeper, who he influenced so much.